by now you're getting the drill, right? So we have for this one, the card that's coming around, which is Debic Jesus. I say now, Debic Jesus. So it should be the number 3 one, right? And this one, so Debic Jesus, it technically means, we use this word for moon, but it is the night sun. So it's that balance there. And then on the back, Gimmikwachwigo, Debic Jesus, Wasabkizium. So again, we're addressing that moon as someone and kind of thinking of that relationship and the way that moon is reflecting light on us. And there are summer camps that we sometimes have with students to teach them they can learn science through their language as well. So it's another thing where there's multiple disciplines that you can work with in terms of using the language to show what knowledge was known originally. So there's that. And now I have the task of introducing him, which we've made as complicated as we possibly could. Not that bad, if you want. So the thing that you can come up here. We'll make it fun, right? The place is right. Exactly. No, you're not kidding. It kind of is, right? So when Karen first asked us about the different scholars, I can honestly say many of these scholars I have either collaborated on something with or taught their works in classes, and yours are no exception to that. I mean, many, many times I'll say, what you need to read is, and hand out work. The thing to say, sort of official capacity, although this is the stuff that you could look up, is that Tallbear is an associate professor at the University of Alberta now. And it's up there, you call that Native Studies?
Faculty of Native Studies, which means we're our own college. You're the only one in North America. Aren't you all jealous?
Yes. I mean, that is so worth knowing. And so she has, as we have given the other folks who have come here in our space, like this that we have, yes. And then the shirt that we did, Elective Quinny, which has the Ho-Chunk, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, the Menominee, the Stockbridge Munsee, and the Oneida words. So you have like this cosmopolitan swirl. So this is these all say hello.
Oh, hello, that's right.
Yeah. Right, yeah, exactly right. So this, in a way, it's to remind folks of a reborn sort of cosmopolitan view of this space. So here's where it gets like Price is Right, right? So I have my little notes where I thought, well, okay, what's important to me that I don't know that you ever even knew, but I grew up in Chaska, Minnesota, which if you're from Minnesota, that's a big division, right? Everything is either Ojibwe or Lakota there. And early on, my dad, who taught elementary school for 38 years, made a point of making sure we not only knew when we would go back up to our territory for things that we practiced every year or celebrations with family. If we're living in Chaska, there were things we had to know. So he made us learn early about the Ochete Shokolan, which are their 7 fires. So I have a Great Lakes class where I assign Audra's book, and they have to learn about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And then we also talk about the Ochete Shokolan on the other side, because we are people of the 3 fires here, and to recognize these vast confederacies, not just little tribes as they might still be left in space, but to recognize those big confederacies and how we balance and what we need to protect. That's important. The other thing that I thought, I better make sure I learn this. My dad made my sister and I remember all 7, but I think in your case, the relevant one would be teaching, or sharing with everyone here, that by welcoming you to our space, we welcome somebody of the Sissiquan, the people of the faith. I won't get this right, the I probably don't say it well, but it's worth trying to say these, right? We all have to learn more languages too, which the way I read that is people among the leaves. I don't know if you want to say more about Sissiquan.
This is interesting about tribal enrollment, right? That sort of post-apocalyptic world we live in. As Dakota people, we actually trace our line back to Metawankatawan, but we're enrolled Sissiquan. So,
so that's whole
different
7 fires
put together on different reservations in ways we necessarily. So I actually don't identify Sissiquan, but I can enroll there because of their configuration of lineage of one water.
So back to the complexity energy, as Bernie was mentioning. But we also have the Decolonizing card is the one that you had. And so to me, if a woman comes visiting into our space, I thought what I could do is, give a gift that recognizes that. So here we have there's still a whole bunch of us actually that will, when it is full moon, they'll take, this has got a little organic tobacco on the bottom, and they'll hold it up and they'll say, well, this is, kind of recognizing the moon. They'll hold it up and they'll go through and they'll think whatever they feel they need to think that month and think of all the grandmothers before them, and they'll throw it into the fire. Where's Carrie? You know what I would say, right? Carrie is infamous for being the one that has the best buffalo yell, because after a woman does that and kind of thinks of the ancestors before her, then we kind of count off and we do what is called, to us, a buffalo yell. And it's sort of this empowering thing for that person, where everybody in the room kind of celebrates and connects with whatever were the concerns for that person. So Carrie, do you mind? That's a buffalo yell. So ready? If we say 1, 2, 3, then let's all do a buffalo yell to welcome him, all right? So 1, 2, 3. So there is also a little earrings that were handed to me by someone before, an amazing, really strong woman. So handle right next to you. I would say yes, at some point, sticking in a fire. I mean, you can hold on to it for years if you want, or just throw it in the sea, whatever seems right to you. And because we also want to recognize that we, as scholars, we try to challenge ourselves as well. I'll give you a copy of my book that's bilingual Ojibwe and English poems. And who knows, you may just read the English half, but you may say to some student you have someday, no, use your language, go crazy with it, do something different. So it was like Price is Right, right? So, just so that we welcome you to our space in a way that recognizes all that we bring to us here. We're really grateful to have you here.
So this is a dense talk, I think. I've given it a couple of times. It's actually a spliced together from a couple of talks. Please silence your phones, because I get distracted. And thank you for the invitation to be here. I really appreciate it. I'm very happy to be here. I'm from Minnesota, South Dakota originally, so this feels closer to home than Edmonton. Relatively closer to home. And thank you to everybody for welcoming me so warmly. So this talk is called Making Love and Relations Beyond Settler Sexuality and Natures, and it's part of a book that I'm working on tentatively called Disrupting Settlement, Sex, and Nature, an Indigenous Logic of Relationality. So in that book, I'm going to analyze entangled sets of rigid and hierarchical Euro-American settler relations imposed as state policy and national culture in the U.S. and in Canada. Hierarchies among humans and non-humans are intimately related to hierarchies and categorizations used among humans. The two co-constitute one another. Settler management of land in North America has always been intimately related to settler management of women, children, Indians, slaves, and non-human animals' bodies as well. So I begin by critiquing both hetero and homonormative, couple-centric, monogamous marriage, or such forms of romantic love more broadly. Then I will segue into a critique of life versus not life binaries, and also engage in a feminist Indigenous reading of interspecies thinking and the new materialisms. Now, I know this probably sounds like everything but the kitchen sink, but by the time I get through the talk, you'll see that there's a logical pathway through these sets of theoretical areas in the fields in which I work between Indigenous studies and science and technology studies, particularly the feminist subfield of science and technology studies. So my overall impression is that settler relations, including both sexual relations and our relations with so-called nature, are not sustainable. They're not sustainable economically, environmentally, or emotionally for lots of persons, both Indigenous and not, and both human and not human persons. So I want to begin with a creative vignette that I've written, which is exactly 100 words, and that's a very generative writing practice for me. I was part of an online writing group with 7 women who did what we call hundreds. We each took a day of the week and we wrote 100 and we shared it online. And so this 100 that I wrote is called Sufficiency.
And the title was inspired by Thomas Prinson's monograph, The Logic of Sufficiency, in which he explains the principle of sufficiency as being, quote, not about denial, not about sacrifice or doing without, but, quote, when resource depletion and overconsumption are real, sufficiency is about doing well. It is about good work and good governance. I think through this logic of sufficiency also within the realm of loving human relations. Do we always need another love only for ourselves? And this includes children. Just like a village might better raise a child, so might a village better sustain individuals in loving relations. So we can read along. Sufficiency. At a giveaway, we do them often at powwows. The family honors one of our own by thanking the people who jingle and shimmer in circle. They are with us. We give gifts in both generous show and as acts of faith in sufficiency. One does not future hoard. We may lament incomplete colonial conversions, our too little bank savings, the circle we hope will sustain. We sustain it. Not so strange, then, that I decline to hoard love and another's body for myself. I cannot have faith in scarcity. I have tried. It cut me from the circle. It was not always so that the monogamous couple ideal reigned. In Public Vows, A History of Marriage and Nation, Nancy Cott argues with respect to the U.S. that the Christian model of lifelong monogamous marriage was not a dominant worldview until the late 19th century, that it took work to make monogamous marriage seem like a foregone conclusion, and that people had to choose to make marriage the foundation for the new nation. In The Importance of Being Monogamous, Sarah Carter also shows how marriage was part of the national agenda in Canada. The marriage fortress was established to guard the Canadian way of life. At the same time that monogamous marriage was solidified as ideal and central to both U.S. and Canadian nation building, Indigenous peoples in these two countries were being viciously restrained, both conceptually and physically inside colonial borders and institutions that included residential schools, churches, missions, and urban relocation programs. These were all designed to save the man and kill the Indian, by cutting the Indian off from the collective, their peoples. Part of saving Indians from their savagery meant pursuing the righteous, monogamous, couple-centric nuclear family co-produced with private property, including the partitioning of the tribal land base into individually owned allotments held under men's names. Pre-Métis feminist Kim Anderson writes that, quote, one of the biggest targets of colonialism was the Indigenous family, unquote, in which women had occupied positions of authority and controlled personal property. The colonial state targeted women's power. It tied land tenure rights to heterosexual, one-on-one, lifelong marriages, thus tying women's economic well-being to men who controlled the property. Indeed, women became property. 150 years after my Dakota ancestors were brought under colonial control, the unsustainable nuclear family is the most commonly idealized alternative to the tribal and extended family context in which I was raised. Prior to colonization, the fundamental social unit of my people was the extended kin group, including plural marriage. The Dakota word for extended family is Tioshpaye. The word for tribe or people is Oyate. My road to studying ethical non-monogamy began early in my observations in tribal communities of mostly failed monogamy, extreme serial monogamy, and disruptions to nuclear family. Throughout my growing up, I was subjected by both whites and natives ourselves to narratives of shortcoming and failure, descriptions of Native American broken families, teenage pregnancies, unmarried mothers, and other failed attempts to paint a white, nationalist, middle-class veneer over our lives. I used to think it was the failures to live up to that ideal that turned me off emphasizing domesticity. And that's why I ran for coastal cities and higher education, why I asserted from a very early age that I would never get married. Now I see that it was not my family's so-called failures, but rather I was suffocating under the weight of the aspirational ideal of a normative middle-class nuclear family, including normative coupledom, period. I was a happy child in those moments when I sat at my great-grandmother's dining room table with 4 generations, and later in her life, 5 generations. We gathered in her small dining room with its burnt orange linoleum and ruffled curtains, at the table beside the antique china cabinet, people overflowing into the equally small living room. All the generations eating, laughing, playing cards, drinking coffee, talking tribal politics, and eating again. The children would run in and out. I would sit quietly next to my grandmother's, hoping no one would notice me. I could then avoid playing children's games and listen instead to the adults' funny stories and wild tribal politics. Couples and marriage and nuclear family got little play there. The matriarch of our family, my great-grandmother, was always laughing. She would tell funny, poignant stories about our family, about families and individuals, both natives and whites, in our small town throughout the 20th century. Aunts and uncles would contribute their childhood memories to build on her stories. My mother would always bring the conversation back to tribal or national politics. A great-grandchild might be recognized for a creative, athletic, or academic accomplishment, and the newest baby would be doted on as a newly arrived human who chose our family. The mom, who might be 18 and unmarried, would have help. As Kim Anderson explains, our traditional societies had been sustained by strong kin relations in which women had significant authority. There was no such thing as a single mother, because Native women and their children lived and worked in extended kin networks. Despite colonial violence against our kin systems, we are, in everyday practice, still adept at extended family. Beyond biological family, we create institutions that function as a tioshpaye. For example, the survival school movement, unfolded in St. Paul and Minneapolis in the 1970s as part of a community response within the American Indian movement to racism in the public schools. Each day opened and closed with a ceremony. Academics were combined with Indigenous, in that case, Anishinaabe culture, and everyone got fed, which for poor children was key. We also have ceremonies to adopt kin. And in my extended family, we engage in a lot of legal adoption. This is aided by the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, that prioritizes the adoption of Native children by tribal families so children have a better chance of staying within their tribal cultures. Indigenous peoples lobbied heavily for that legislation as one response to the colonial kidnapping of children from Indigenous families who were impoverished by colonialism and deemed unfit for not attaining the middle-class normative nuclear family structure. Our tribal webs of kinship share with ethical non-monogamy when ethical non-monogamy goes beyond individualistic discourses of freedom and sexual self-actualization to actually make family and community. It shares with ethical non-monogamy, our tribal webs of kinship, the possibility for greater emotional, environmental, and economic sustainability. So I would not argue that contemporary forms of ethical non-monogamy in the West are the same as the kind of traditional non-monogamy Indigenous peoples might have had. But we live saturated in a colonial world in which we have to think about how to articulate our traditional Indigenous templates with newer forms of relating and being, and that's kind of what I'm talking about here. I'll come back to that, but right now I want to talk about caretaking other than human relations and indigenizing interspecies thinking, and so now I'm getting into more central academic debates. So I want to link this particular biopolitical topic, the managing of intimate human relations entangled with land and property through monogamous marriage, to other academic conversations that I think similarly need to be informed by Indigenous standpoints. I want to talk about non-humans now, and how Indigenous thought accords greater animacy to non-humans, including non-organisms such as stone and particular places. And I'll explain some of those terms. So we've recently seen an upsurge in the field of critical animal studies, in which social science and humanities scholars are attempting to recover knowledge territory claimed for several centuries by the Western science, the natural sciences. And they are attempting to lessen hierarchies between Westerners and their non-human others. A good example of this is multi-species ethnography, in which scholars apply anthropological approaches to studying social relations between humans and non-humans. Evan Kirksey and Stefan Helmreich wrote in a 2010 issue of Cultural Anthropology that new anthropological accounts are starting to appear in which non-humans, previously relegated to the realm of bios, to the status of bare life or that which is killable are now considered alongside humans with legibly biographical and political lives. Multi-species ethnography shows how organisms, for example, animals, plants, fungi, and microbes, shape and are shaped by political, economic, and cultural forces. New work in critical animal studies articulates with Dorian Sagan's work on interspecies communities and his critique of two linear evolutionary narratives. Sagan is a well-known science writer. He is the son of astronomer, the late Carl Sagan, and the late biologist Lynn Margulis. He seeks to dismantle hierarchies in the relationships of Westerners to their non-human others. In speaking of symbiogenesis, that's his word, and the importance of microbes in constituting humans, Sagan explains, "We are crisscrossed and cohabited by stranger beings, intimate visitors who affect our behavior, appreciate our warmth, and are in no rush to leave. Like all visible life forms, we humans are composites." This account of symbiogenesis seems to lean toward an ethos of we are all related. I read in Sagan that we are all of us, human and non-human, networked sets of social, biological relations. He calls such human, non-human networks interspecies communities, which resonates with what Vine Deloria Jr. called an American Indian metaphysic, back in the 80s, I think. A set of first principles we must possess in order to make sense of the world in which we live. In his essay of the same title, Deloria wrote that the best description of this term, American Indian metaphysic, is the realization that the world and all its possible experiences constituted a social reality, a fabric of life in which everything had the possibility of intimate, knowing relationships, because ultimately, everything was related. Yet Deloria and Sagan's understanding of intimate human, non-human relations are not in complete harmony. In his opening of his 2010 American Anthropological Association keynote, Dorian Sagan turned his attention to life, and he opened that talk with this phrase. "Well, it is to this universe that I want to turn again, and to a specific part of it. I want to turn to life, and within that part, a fascinating subsystem, the one in which, of course, we are most interested. That is humanity ourselves." For Sagan, life is limited to things that are organismically defined. This tends to be true as well of social scientists and humanities scholars who engage in animal studies, and not only biophysical scientists. Multi- and interspecies conversations in the academy, in the Western Academy, restrict attention to beings that live according to a definition that cannot completely contain indigenous standpoints. So in an American Indian metaphysic, as Deloria describes it, the notion of interspecies must be stretched to include non-human others that are not understood in even critical Western frameworks as living. An example lies in the knowledge production of my colleague Craig Howe. Craig is an Oglala Lakota architect, anthropologist, and Lakota studies expert who left the mainstream academy to found the Center for American Indian Research and Native Studies, or CAIRNS, which he built on his family's land between the Rosebud and Pine Ridge Indian reservations in South Dakota. So in addition to running Lakota and Native American Studies workshops at the facility, Craig lives there in daily contact with a host of non-humans on the land, and he documents those relations weekly in his blog, Oko Iawapi, or Week Count, which is a digital weekly version of a Lakota winter count. So Craig's quite innovative. You can look that up on the internet, his blog. So for example, Howe engages with rabbits who pointedly observe him when he works outside. They alternately take afternoon naps in the shade of his structures. They sometimes thwart his architectural projects with their own work, their adamant digging. He studies the lodges of spiders, which are akin to teepees in their form. And that's a spider lodge turned upside down, so really the teepee form would come down off the bottom of that wood plank pit. So he follows the movements of star people in relation to distant buttes as he plots and builds the structures of the Cairns facility. One could see Howe as studying rabbits, studying spiders, or studying the cosmos, entities that are less animate than his human self, or that's what a Western philosophical point of view would hold. But such hierarchy is not found in Craig Howe's words and photographs. In his blog, Craig documents his consistent relations with non-humans, including some currently excluded in animal studies, and the ways in which they do work in the world and they help constitute the land and the buildings that he inhabits. So now I want to turn to a second academic conversation in which non-Indigenous thinkers are addressing that divide between life, not life. Because there are some Western thinkers who are also dissatisfied with defining the agential beings as completely synonymous with organisms, right? This is why I love this stuff, because finally Western thinkers are being able to come to our conversation table with Indigenous people. So they're attempting, new materialists, to expand conceptions of humans' intimate relations. So work in the new materialism seeks to extend our understanding of how non-human lives press into and are co-constituted with human lives, and therefore how they are agentic in our world. It stands in the space where animal studies and multi- or interspecies thinking fall short. In a volume, New Materialism's Ontology, Agency, and Politics, Kuhl and Frost explain, and I think you can read along, yeah. Finally, we are summoning a new materialism in response to a sense that the radicalism of the dominant discourses which have flourished under the cultural turn is more or less exhausted. We share the feeling current among many researchers that the dominant constructivist orientation to social analysis, think about the social construction of race if you want, or gender, is inadequate for thinking about matter, materiality, and politics in ways that do justice to the contemporary context of biopolitics and global political economy. Similarly, Jane Bennett in Vibrant Matter calls for us to take seriously the vitality of things, meaning the capacity of things such as edibles, commodities, storms, metals, those are her examples, not only to impede or block the will and designs of humans, but also to act as quasi-agents or forces with their own trajectories, propensities, and tendencies. Bennett also refers to this as an enchanted materialism. So why should we care about this? Like Kuhl and Frost, Bennett suggests that taking seriously the vitality of non-human, non-living, supposedly, things might shift our political responses to public problems. And we might think about this right now as the Alberta fires are burning up north. As of yesterday, an area greater than the size of New York City, I've also seen the comparison of Chicago, is burning. So it's a formidable being. It's really interesting to listen to the officials on the ground in Fort McMurray. If you're reading the news, they're talking about how the fires will find any unburned area and they will go for them. They're speaking about it as a being with a will and design of its own. And that formidable being, that fire, is itself born of many complex relations, right? If we think about the relationships between the landscape, climate change, humans, the things that we're doing, natural weather patterns as well, all coming together. So Bennett and other humanists, as well as social scientists, are reappraising the importance of materiality to human, social, and cultural life. The world is mediated heavily through culture, increasingly so in the Anthropocene. But the material is also productive. It's not simply static, dead, and acted upon. The new materialists hold that to really grasp the nature of and potential solutions for the world's most critical problems, environmental degradation, climate change, poverty, systemic violence, and warfare, non-humans in all their myriad forms must be given their due. In the book Animacies, Mel Chen has a similar intellectual political project. After an extended illness and forced to rethink the boundary between life and death, Chen interrogates that fragile division between animate and inanimate. Chen disrupts the stubborn binaries of life versus death, human versus animal, dynamism versus stasis, subject versus object that underlie the most violent hierarchies in our world. And as Indigenous people, we know that, right? Because we've been on the sort of disempowered, degraded side of those binaries consistently, as have many other marginalized peoples and non-humans. So Chen invokes the language of animacy in place of life or liveliness. Now, I am comfortable using the term life in a more expansive than biological meaning as part of my understanding of animacy, but for Chen, who would understand life probably more strictly in biological terms, animacy is defined in relation to agency, awareness, mobility, and liveness. Animacy is much more than the state of being animate, is what Chen says. Like Bennett, Chen writes of the animacy of metal, more specifically mercury and lead that poison human and non-human bodies. So Mel Chen and I have discussed our similar desire to disrupt human-animal life, not life divides. Among the new materialists, Chen thinks more than I think others do about the role of Indigenous thought in understanding and disrupting what Chen calls animacy hierarchies, so those hierarchies of life. This is unsurprising because Chen's particular project is to explore the roles of race and sexuality in shaping animacy as a specific kind of affective and material construct that is non-neutral in relation to humans, animals, living, and dead things. But a key difference between Chen and I is that Chen is really seeking a secular language, that's Mel Chen's word, to express the animacy of non-humans beyond dumb or lifeless materiality. And so does Bennett, who explains that material vibrancy is not a spiritual supplement or life force added to the matter said to house it. So they're both looking for secular language, right, as are most people, I think, in the Western Academy. But as an Indigenous person, I am actually quite comfortable, well, I'll talk about this in a minute, in folding spirits or souls into descriptions of the beingness of non-humans. Charles Eastman wrote in his 1911 book, The Soul of the Indian, that the elements and majestic forces in nature, lightning, wind, water, fire, and frost, were regarded with awe as spiritual powers, but always secondary and intermediate in character. We believe that the spirit pervades all things, all creation, and that every creature possesses a soul in some degree, though not necessarily a soul conscious of itself. The tree, the waterfall, the grizzly bear, each is an embodied force and as such an object of reverence. Now, Eastman was born into an Indian world, but at that moment when Indian people were dispossessed from their traditional lands in what is today Minnesota. Some were killed, others were imprisoned after an 1862 war against settlers, and some fled to Canada. Eventually, many ended up on reservations in South Dakota and Minnesota. Eastman converted to Christianity, and he trained in Boston as a medical doctor. In the early 20th century, he wrote of American Indian life and history from an Indian standpoint. In the passage above, he explains an American Indian, quote, spiritual approach to the U.S. American Christian reader. And that's important to remember who he was writing for, right? He was writing for a liberal white audience at the time, and the liberals at that moment weren't necessarily in favor of massacring natives. They were in favor of civilizing them, right? Killing the Indian and saving the man. And so that, I think, to some degree colors that language. Both Eastman and Vine Deloria Jr. then can be understood within a framework that posits social relations, not only between animals, but also with energy, spirits, rocks, and stars, and the constitution of American Indian knowledge about the world. Vine Deloria Jr. again called this an American Indian metaphysic, an understanding of the intimate, knowing relatedness of all things. As I refer to them, the co-constitutive entanglements between the material and the immaterial, that is, Indigenous peoples' social relations also with spirit beings, described by Eastman and Deloria, constitute a boundary crossing that is difficult for interspecies and new materialist thinkers. Non-Indigenous society has done a lot of work, right, to erect a barrier between what it is thought humans can know through their materialistic empirical investigations and what some humans believe to exist beyond the knowable material world. This knowing-belief divide, as Paul Nadasny points out, is a form of discrediting language, used, for example, by even sympathetic anthropologists when explaining Indigenous peoples' cosmologies. The same derisive binary of knowledge, often claimed to be for the good of all, versus the beliefs of Indigenous peoples, is commonly cited in negative scientific and public reaction when Indigenous people protest, for example, genome research on their blood or on the bones of their ancestors. You know, we have knowledge, you guys have beliefs, isn't that quaint? So I really encourage people to question your use of those words. When I teach, I try to tell my students, we're not talking about beliefs in here, and let's stop a moment and figure out how to talk about what we know. And it's hard even for us, right, to stop and do that. So both Eastman and Deloria get classified as American Indian intellectuals, the pertinent 20th century racial category, but they were both in fact Dakota people. And it's not simply ethnocentric that I'm drawing on them. Their work constitutes prominent literature in English that is useful for thinking about these things. It would be exciting to see thinkers who work in the intellectual production of other Indigenous peoples, I think, add to this conversation. I'm really interested in working with other young scholars who are doing that, some of whom are in this room. So I want to call attention to the recent work of yet another scholar of UMA Indigenous thought, that's David Delgado Shorter. He provides us language beyond the spiritual for capturing the kinds of interspecies or cross beings, forms of relating that Indigenous peoples have engaged in. And he says, critical analyses of the oral stories and earliest ethnographic accounts continue to reveal that rather than being spiritual, Native people were relating. Less cumbersome than intersubjective, related might best replace spiritual, since it neither denies possible theisms or hierarchies. One's relations are not solely related by blood or tribal heritage. They are the families chosen and not chosen. They counter solitude with solidarity. They provide meaning and identity beyond the confines of race, tribe, and species. In these ways, being related offers more than any abstract notion of religion or spirituality ever could. Indigenous thinkers have important contributions to make to conversations in which human societies are rethinking the range of non-human beings with whom they see themselves in intimate relation. And precisely because of the varied ways in which Indigenous peoples relate, possibilities for being in the world. The advantage of Indigenous analytical frameworks that are not secular is that they are more likely to have kept sight of the profound influence in the world of beings categorized by Western thinkers, both the church and science, in hierarchical ways, as animal or less animate. Now that theorists seek frameworks for dismantling those hierarchies, we should remember that not everyone needs to summon a new analytical framework or needs to renew a commitment to the vitality of so-called things. Indigenous standpoints that never constructed hierarchies in quite the same way can and should be at the forefront of this new ethnographic and theoretical work. Bringing Indigenous thought into these conversations does not simply increase intellectual rigor and expand multiculturalism in the academy. And by Indigenous thought, by the way, I do not argue for some static notion of Indigenous traditional knowledge, but rather engagement with the thinking that living Indigenous peoples are doing today. And we need to bring that into these conversations. So infiltrating the academy is but a step towards a more important goal, which is to construct disciplines that better serve our interests and the interests of others who have been historically marginalized. The disciplines are looked to by a knowledge society to support policy decisions and to address pressing societal problems. Indeed, there has been considerable damage done to both Indigenous people and our non-human relations when we have been displaced from traditional lands, had communal landholding disrupted, been subjected to related assimilationist policies, including forced conversions to Christianity, forced conversions to monogamy and private landholding, and the imposition of a spirit/material divide that fundamentally misunderstands Indigenous ontologies. The cruel imposition of this Euro-American worldview has resulted with our traditional lands that have been subjected to severe and ongoing environmental degradation. It's resulted in a degradation of our bodies and our relationships with those lands, the impositions of those kinds of binaries. How am I doing on time? How many minutes more should I take? Oh, okay. I'm not going to go on that long because we didn't Q&A. Okay. So I'm now going to turn to a form of life in a stone. So I'm going to turn from non-human organisms and from multi-species relations, from Indigenous DNA to Pipestone. So I've spent the last dozen years studying the life and death, both material and symbolic, that inhere in the production of Native American DNA taken from blood samples, frozen out of place and time. Both blood and the DNA it carries are what we could call material/semiotic. So that means they're both material, but they also have signs and symbols. And you can't understand the concept of Native American DNA solely as sets of molecular sequences, right? But you need those semiotic things, histories of race, racial categories, concepts also help form what we think of as Native American DNA. This is why when a scientist says this is all objective and there's no politics in this, please, you can even articulate the concept of Native American DNA without the history of colonialism and old school race categories, right? So, where am I? So it surprised me when I started this ethnographic work in Pipestone last year, and this is Pipestone, Minnesota, just on the South Dakota border. I was born here. My mom was born there. My grandma went to Indian school there. But there's no recognized tribe there, so all the Pipestone Dakota community are either enrolled in Flanders, South Dakota, or Sisseton, South Dakota, but they live in Pipestone. And you'll see why they help caretake this place. So it was really interesting when I started working there that I realized, I thought this was a completely different ethnographic project than Native American DNA, but it's basically the same narratives and stories that condition the Pipestone quarries as condition the production of Native American DNA. So I'm looking at the life that inheres in a particular stone, and then the social relations that proliferate as that stone emerges from earth, as it's carved into pipe, and as it's passed from hand to hand. You will have heard these called peace pipes, some of you. That's not what we call them. So Pipestone is otherwise known as Catlinite, after a 19th century Euro-American artist who painted the site in southwest Minnesota where the red stone is cut from the earth. There's a creation story that tells us about the blood in that stone, a story that, along with our loving attention to it, enables us to apprehend Pipestone's vibrancy, in the words of the materialists. Pipestone plays a fundamental role in our peoplehood. Indeed, the Pipestone quarries comprise a site that is central to Dakota peoplehood. But unlike Indigenous or Native American DNA, I'm not, of course, referring to cellular vibrancy, but we can describe Pipestone as vibrant because without it, prayers would be grounded, human social relations impaired, and the everyday lives of quarriers and carvers could be depleted of the meaning they derive from working with that stone. The story that sort of shapes the ground of that place is a flood story. Many cultures have them, right? In which a young woman is the only one to survive atop a hill during a great flood, and then all the blood of her dead people, once the waters recede, are pooled in one place, and that becomes the blood of the people becomes the blood red stone. And so this place is talked about as a sacred place today. But the quarry is not only special to Dakota, but it's also special to other Indigenous people who dig there today and to others for whom the pipe is also central. The stone there is sometimes spoken of as a relative in the Dakota language, hearkening back to that creation narrative. Like scientists in earlier centuries with their imperative to bleed Indigenous peoples before it was too late, a 19th century Euro-American painter and early 20th century geologists and government agents saw the place where the red stone lies as an artifact of a waning culture and time. They made a national monument to conserve it. The binaries at play then and now are past versus present, tradition versus modernity, alive versus dead or dying. U.S. Park Service pamphlets from the Pipestone, Minnesota quarry represent pipes as artifacts, as craft objects, and they detail the geology and the history of white incursion in the quarry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These pamphlets also detail the regulatory response of the U.S. government in the face of those incursions. Now, these material and regulatory histories outlined in Park Service materials are important. But like the production of indigenous biological samples abstracted from living bodies and vibrant peoples, Western politics and knowledge surrounding the quarry in effect maintain a knowledge binary between the material and the immaterial. That said, in good liberal multiculturalist tradition, the Park Service also acknowledges indigenous spiritual beliefs and practices related to Pipestone. And indigenous peoples at the quarries resist binary narratives to a degree. While Dakota quarriers and carvers reject narratives of dead and vanished Indians, past versus present, the sacred and related to this, the traditional, are key concepts for some of those quarriers and for many of our people. The stone is also sometimes spoken of as a relative, and the quarries are at the center of quarrier lives, regardless of whether quarriers refer to the quarry as sacred or not. Not everybody does. But the idea of the sacred is a big fish in the rushing waters surrounding Pipestone quarry discourse. So it is not only science that relies upon a material-immaterial binary, but it is the discourse of the sacred, I propose, taken up by Indigenous peoples ourselves that furthers that material-immaterial binary. The Park Service and some concerned federally recognized tribes currently struggle ethically with the commercial sale of Pipestone objects at the quarries. There's a debate taking place now in Indian country and in federal meetings about this so-called sacred stone that can only be seen as such if we Indigenous peoples simultaneously embrace the idea of the profane. This stance is potentially at odds with a view of relationality that would acknowledge that Indigenous peoples and the stone have long existed in more intimate and complex sets of relations than the notion of the sacred can represent. I want to just talk about the fire for a second, the Alberta fires. I saw the most beautiful description of that really difficult situation that's happening on the Facebook page of a young, I think she's a young Cree feminist in Edmonton. And she was saying, you need to be careful with, the fire is, this is a powerful being, and we need to be really careful with this. And so, because there was there are arguments going on between people that are against the tar sands and all of that and saying, oh, this is karmic payback and relating it to climate change, of course. But I haven't seen Indigenous people talking like that in Canada. They're very clear. They're clear about those colonial critiques. They never let up on them, but they also have reverence for that fire. And what you see in the mainstream media is, oh, this is a monster. There's a discussion of this fire like it's a big evil being. But Indigenous people have a much more complex assessment of the beingness and the power of that fire that can really hurt you, right, if you don't have the right kind of respect for that. So I want us to think about those kinds of complex sets of relations, power relations, and think hard when we use that language of the sacred, because I think it obscures those complex sets of relations. And I'm interested in us digging into Indigenous languages and figuring out how are we talking about the power of these beings, how are we talking about relatedness, because in English, all we are left with, and I see this because I teach Native Studies every year in Japan for 3 weeks, all we are left with in English is, in American English, are these Christian metaphors. And they color too much the way that we engage even in Indigenous thought in English, and we totally engage in Indigenous thought in English, but we are hampered by this language. And I think in our Indigenous languages, as I'm seeing in some of the translation going on here, we speak about these things in a little bit more complicated ways. So indeed, describing objects and practices as sacred may also be a strategy for survival or a particular historically conditioned form of remembering that may not align precisely with our ancestors' pre-colonial understandings of how to regard an object or practice. Literal red human blood, which is so important for DNA research, and the blood red stone have been translated in this contemporary language into quote-unquote resources. And that characterization is troubled by Dakota and other Indigenous quarriers and carvers and Indigenous people who think about DNA, but it's not undone. And I think that's a lot of the limitations, right, of this language that we're working with. So I want to turn again to the words of an Indigenous feminist to link the obligations to human kin with our other than human kin. The Assiniboine scholar Kate Shanley defines Indigenous feminism in a way that I think is commonly accepted among us. And she says it seeks equality in 2 ways that do not concern mainstream women, although I hope that's changing. Number 1, on the individual level, the Indian woman struggles to promote the survival of a social structure whose organizational principles represent notions of family different than those of the mainstream. And 2, on a societal level, the people seek sovereignty as a people in order to maintain a vital legal and spiritual connection to the land in order to survive as a people. So going back to Kim Anderson, she explains how pregnancy and what she calls the emotional intelligence of mothering, those are what really transformed her into an Indigenous feminist. She describes pregnancy as a wake-up call about how far we have strayed from life-affirming principles in mainstream and Indigenous societies alike. She links the deplorable conditions of many contemporary Native women and children, I would add men, the poor, the sexually deviant, our other than human relations, to colonization and its handmaiden patriarchy. And she explains that women were considered the head of the household because they were primarily responsible for the work involved in child rearing and in managing the home and community. Empowered motherhood, she says, was not only a practice but also an analogy that allowed women to assert their authority at various political levels. In a number of Indigenous societies, it was older women who made decisions that set the direction for all of the people, and they did so as clan mothers, through women's councils, and as head women of their own extended families. Anderson analyzes the roles of women in what I would call governance at multiple levels. Her use of motherhood is complex and attuned to how maternal roles are entangled in patriarchal policy and movements, and if you read the entire corpus of her work, you'll see that. She advocates a form of mothering that I translate as caretaking, and which I see as detachable from the cisgendered, biologically reproductive woman's body. And Anderson would certainly not reserve mothering or caretaking for the woman recognized in the dominant culture as the mother. For her, it is about working with other women and men in community organizations to advance Native women's health and well-being, and that's a quote from her, which she always links to the advancement of our peoples as a whole. So women are important because they're central to the well-being of the people as a whole, and to a broader set of relations as well. Her work, more recent work on Indigenous men and masculinities, does a similar thing. It links Indigenous men's well-being with men and masculinities being defined in multiple ways, to the advancement of Indigenous peoples broadly. At a December 2015 symposium at the University of Alberta, Anderson shared an illustrative, moving, and complex story about one man who nurtured family. And I think I can tell this because it was also videotaped there. She remembered her father, who was described as always working hard to make all of the children laugh. He was also the one who cooked for the family. He imparted humor and nurturing to their lives, although he eventually drank himself to death. She did, in that story, what I argue sustains Indigenous peoples in an age that some have dubbed the Anthropocene. We hold accounts of death and destruction, and we did this here this morning, right, in the wake of an apocalypse that our peoples have already endured for a century or two or more, side by side with stories of life and recognition of our ongoing relations in this place. With that story, she both mourned and affirmed while she addressed masculinities in a way that was not only about men's well-being, but as with her work on women, it was about caretaking the people. Elsewhere, she has written that healthy life is maintained through balance between the various life forms, including men and women, and that mothering or caretaking promotes the health and well-being of the people and the environments they live in. Therefore, a key way to understand Indigenous feminism, as articulated by Kim Anderson and by Idle No More as well, is that it has at its core the idea of caretaking the people and social justice organizing as powerful acts of governance. In November 2015, Yvonne S. Marquez published a blog post on autostraddle.com titled, "Badass Black Queer Women Paved the Way for the Mizzou Movement." She highlighted Black Lives Matter activism after several explicitly anti-Black racism incidents that resulted in the resignation of the University of Missouri president. And she says, "What's most interesting and empowering about these student demonstrations was that it was inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement happening in nearby St. Louis and Ferguson, Missouri. And just like the Black Lives Matter movement, the Concerned Student 1950 group was led and organized by queer Black women." I hadn't known that until I read this. "The young Black men, the football players at Missouri, did something important in refusing to play football without the University of Missouri administration making some official apologies and amends for structural racism on campus. But Marquez wanted to give credit where credit was also due. I see these young queer Black women sharing ground with Indigenous women," and that's my Indigenous standpoint. I'm currently writing something about this, and my colleague Alondra Nelson is Alondra at Columbia, I think, too, right? I'm hoping will be in conversation with me on this. Marquez wanted to give credit where credit was due. I see those young queer Black women as sharing ground with Indigenous women, and one way to understand their actions is as caretaking their people, their social justice organizing as powerful acts of governance. All of that speaks to me about asserting kinship away from patriarchal settler ideas of it. I'm reminded of Idle No More, which links the protection of Aboriginal treaty rights to the protection of the earth. I see the actions of the young queer Black women in Missouri, like the work of Idle No More, as a form of mothering, as Kim Anderson would call it, but again, mothering or caretaking is not the domain alone of cisgender biologically reproductive women. I don't downplay the hard and dangerous work that some women do, but I think that many others can and already do play these caretaking roles. The founders of Idle No More and these badass Black queer women are examples of the conceptual, emotional, and organizing work this kind of caretaking and change takes. Now, when I refer to caretaking relations, I also consider responsibilities to relations that are no longer material or not yet material. And I have another story for you. When my mother-in-law passed, I was reminded of how differently Dakota people and settler culture conceptualize responsibility to kin and the implications of materiality. It was difficult for me to watch my co-parents' family grieve her death. Unlike in Artioshbae, they do not sit with their dying through the days and nights of passing. First in the hospital for however long it takes, and then afterwards in a 3-day wake. There is no oyate to bring food for the family in hospital. They do not tell stories for days around the hospital bed, and then the star quilt-covered casket, punctuated by laughter, suddenly swallowed voices, silence, and then tears. For we Dakota, death is an event to be marked in community. I could bring none of that to my mother-in-law. She had Alzheimer's, and while my tribal family still claims my co-parent as kin, his does not similarly claim me after the severing of the state contract. although I think they might be slowly coming to understand as we remain amicable friends and colleagues and they see us spend time in each other's homes that they can reconceptualize this relationship in a way that's still kinship, so I'm hopeful. My mother-in-law died outside the minutes of their daily visits. They had a hard time watching her. I don't understand their relationship to death. Why is coming to the end of a good journey unbearable to witness? It seems like the quieting of her vitality, it seemed like it was undignified to them or something, and they shouldn't be watching it. So after thinking hard on this, I concluded that a fundamental conceptual break conditions their relationship to death. Materiality is severed from spirit, for lack of a better word, in their world. It is not only materialists who do this, believers do this too. The relationships are long and intimate between Western science and Christianity. There is no dichotomy in their shared conceptual ethical framework that does not become hierarchy. Life over death, human over animal, man over woman, civilized over savage. Death is bad because death ends life. In such a worldview, spirits do not legitimately bridge worlds in mundane ceremonies or in dreams, but spirits in my world are our social relations. Be they wise or imperfect, some were human, some may be again, we don't know. We tribal people don't have scripture or a Google map plotting the streets of the spirit world. We don't all share one named broker from this world to the next. We don't pretend to know much, but we do know that death of the body opens up another stage of being, not only materially, but in ways we cannot yet measure. We have all seen or heard it. We may not all have the same relations with those who move without bodies amongst us, but it is impossible to live in a tribal community and not live within a world where these spirit persons do things. For us, materiality is part of beingness, not the other way around. So in conclusion, I return to my Tioshpae and to tribal peoples. I don't anymore see our failures at lasting monogamy and nuclear family as failure. Some in my family face life choices far more restricted than mine are now. Others were simply unwilling to sacrifice a life lived daily amongst extended family and tribe, as I have done in order to pursue professional opportunities far from home. From where I stand, it looks like most of my extended family members have more security in our small town tribal community or in the urban Indian community in which I spent part of my childhood than they do in Eurocentric traditions of nuclear family and marriage. Of course, like ethical non-monogamy, the relations of the Tioshpae are demanding, and it is no bed of roses every day. I see us deep inside the shifting walls of this colonial edifice, which took most of the world's resources to build, experimenting and working incrementally with tools and technologies that we did not craft. I see us combining these indigenous cultural templates in any open space we can find to build lives and communities of relations that make any sense to us at all. And this will go hand in hand with not only repairing our extended families and our indigenous communities, but it will involve reparative kin-making with non-humans, with the places in which our peoples emerged as peoples. As we do this, we cannot avoid the question then about who gets to have babies, who gets to form particular kinds of families, and whose children will flourish at the expense of others, both human and non-human. So families are not just simply personal choices, right? These are community choices, and there are implications for all of us in the kinds of families that we choose to make and inhabit. And I just want to leave you with a blessing. That's my lovely Pembina Hall at University of Alberta. And yes, we have a teepee, and now we have a Métis cart out front as well. And this is a blessing I wrote for Valentine's Day, but you guys can have it too. May your networks of love and relations be many and not caged within settler colonial norms of rapacious individualism, hierarchies of life, and ownership of land, bodies, and desires. Thank you. That's a long talk, I know. Thank you for your attention. You're very attentive. Questions? Okay, 20, so just tell me when. Okay, yes.
Hi, I really appreciate your wonderful insights and all the connections you're drawing. I've been working with the concept of the sacred in Chicana art and performance, and I was really taken by your sort of somewhat sideline comments about how the sacred sort of capitulates to the same binary of material and non-material, human and non-human. And I wondered if you could say more about that.
Well, it's something I'm just starting to write about, and I also have students that are working. So I've got a student working in Cree, who's also looking for language to talk about these, what I would call relationality. So I don't have a lot of data for you yet, but that's sort of the analytical framework that I'm using as I'm interviewing and doing participant observation at the quarries. And then I've got some students working on it in very different kinds of projects. So the student I've got working on beadwork. I mean, we take this word up sacred so much in English, and I think, and I've heard other people say, David Shorter's also interviewed tribal elders on this, and they're like, well, yeah, that's not how we say it in our language, but that's the best I can do in English, right? And I do think within our ancestors' languages, I wouldn't say it's my language because I'm an English speaker as a first language, right? But in the language of my people, there are ways, I think, to talk about these things that are much more analytically robust than the way we can speak about them in English. And I'm interested in us theorizing from out of Indigenous languages, actually. If we want to. Not everybody's going to want to do that, but this English is so saturated with Christianity. When I went to Japan, I thought, I can't even talk to these Japanese students, and their English is fine. They don't get the references. They're not Christians, and that's when you realize how thoroughly it saturates even our ability as Indigenous people to speak about these things. So, yes.
Yeah, just following up on that question, I'm also interested in performance and language. I'm wondering if in English we can take a cue from Latin American Spanish, which is so full of Nahuatl, Quechua, and Mayan words.
Oh, it is?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. For very common, mundane things like food.
But did the orientation to the world come through with the word? Because we have plenty of place names in Indigenous languages, but I'm not sure much comes through, right?
I think sometimes it
Sometimes,
does.
yeah.
Sometimes it does, but so just I think even you mentioned Chicana, Mexican Spanish. There's in urban Chilango circles, there people who are mestizo Mexico City youth who use the word tonali to talk about in a very kind of slang way their feelings, their heart, their spirit, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in seeing how that comes up and wondering how that can happen in English too.
Mm-hmm.
I write and work in both English and Spanish. But, we use in English words like geist, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah, geist.
Yeah, and zeitgeist, and I don't know, borrow from French and from some...
Because it's not in English,
Well,
right?
why not borrow from Indigenous
Yeah.
languages and center those words and make them, coin them? I'm all for that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's quite exciting, actually. I mean, we have a lot of young scholars that are wanting to do this work. So I was telling somebody at dinner last night, it's my mom's generation and my generation where there was no language taught. So my grandparents learned it as children but got it beaten out of them in boarding school. My great-grandparents were first language speakers. And now the children, because the tribal school movement and the tribal college movement has been there since the late 70s and early 80s, now we have a bunch of language revitalization, but there were two generations, right? The baby boomers and Gen X, where I'm from, where it didn't happen. So, yeah. Yes?
I'm really curious on kind of the conflicts of how to bridge the issues with science and kind of the paradigm like scientific language and more animistic or holistic way of thinking. So, and I'm thinking specifically about kind of frontline struggles with climate change. And we could talk about the fire or just climate change in general. Where on one hand, as an activist, one is constantly asserting the importance of science. Don't be a science denier. Climate change is real, right? So there's an importance, at least from a point of view, to assert the very thing, the very kind of paradigm that negates some of the subtlety that you're speaking of. And yet, as with the fire, one could certainly admire its animate power, but politically one might want to really drive home the point to the resistors of any kind of environmental sanity that there are things going on here that need this kind of analysis. I don't know if I'm being real clear about this, but there's something in these contradictions that are so enmeshed, and you seem to be trying to think of a way kind of through it.
I get this question a lot, although the way you word it is more full-bodied than the way people usually I get, well, we need science, so we can't just throw it out, right? Another ethnographic project I have is, and it's turned into more of a mentoring and organizing project. I have some papers I'm working on where I'm doing ethnography with Indigenous bioscientists. Mostly in the U.S., I might move into Canada a little bit, and I did that after the Native American DNA work. It's been really interesting to interview them, and so I hang out at a lot of scientific meetings like the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science, and it's really interesting. They are largely from land-based communities, and I didn't expect that because being in Native American and Indigenous studies, I would say the majority of scholars in this field seem to me to be living in diaspora or have come out of diaspora. And that is not true of Indigenous biological scientists. They came straight off the res, almost without exception. I'm like, what? I did not expect that. I think what happened was they were taking care of animals, or they were hunting, or they were involved in agriculture. They got interested in cellular level things is partly. And they are able to, it's really interesting to watch them, and this is why when I became an advocate for diversifying science, I used to think, oh, that's just a browning of the laboratory, that's not going to matter. I actually think it will matter to diversify who does science and who's in the lab in the field. They will hold in one hand evolutionary theory and have no problem dealing with that, and in the other hand, they will tolerate the things that they don't know very well, and they have no need usually to reconcile these things. They're fine with them being separate bodies of knowledge and being irreconcilable. And they will actually go home, and because they come from these land-based communities, they often have access to medicine people. They'll go home, they'll have a talk about, I encountered this in the lab, I have to dissect this thing, that's a bad omen, I don't want to be around, or I have to kill mice, or whatever, and they'll figure out ways to deal with this. Because of course our ancestors maybe didn't have ceremonies for dealing with this, right? And so they're figuring out new ways to approach this that are within the cultural tenets. But the main thing that's interesting to me is not the production of ceremonies, you can dissect a cadaver. What's really interesting to me is that they can hold these two irreconcilable bodies of knowledge together and just proceed with the work that they do. And they have gravitated towards principal investigator PIs, if they're not Indigenous, that are women, that are, one had a Nigerian PI. They're gravitating towards PIs that come from cultures in which they don't just poo-poo having a bad omen or being caring about respecting the spirit of the dead, right? And you can't have people poo-pooing that stuff. You can't have these arrogant principal investigators who are keeping all kinds of diverse people out of the laboratory because they can't tolerate anything that's not within their narrow materialist worldview, right? So I think actually we can change science and to incorporate some of the robust knowledges and ideas. Ryan Deloria was saying for most of his career, I don't reject science. I want you guys to have a wider array of hypotheses that are informed by the knowledges of a broader array of people. So this is going to be a lifelong study for me, right? I mean, we're not going to see the fruits of these young, diverse scientists for another few generations, but I'm being Pollyanna and hoping that it's going to help change science. And yeah, I'm very interested in science. You can't do science and technology studies even if you're critical without being really interested, right? I don't know if that answers the question totally, but yes, right here, and then I'll go back to this.
Thank you for your talk. This was very generative. I've been thinking about similar issues in regards to Indigenous scientific knowledges and animals and lands. So this was great. I was wondering, I think this is closely connected to your question, but about the kind of way of thinking about something like a giant forest fire as a powerful being that deserves reverence and respect, even while
it doesn't mean it's nice to you or likes you.
Yes, yeah. In the context of like overall climate change, since that's what my dissertation project is considering, about how the Indigenous scientific knowledge of approaching it as a being changes a kind of broader global discussions of climate change as an apocalyptic ongoing event.
I was so caught up in what you were saying. Did you ask a question?
I probably didn't clearly put a question mark at the end of that. How does this approach of saying that this isn't like a crisis or a disaster or an Anthropocene punishment, but this is a being, change how we think about those sort of larger global questions?
You know, I'm thinking out loud here. I wouldn't say it's not a disaster, right? I mean, it's, but I think looking at the conditions that have produced this being in a much more powerful incarnation than we usually see it, right? I mean, I think there's a lot there for scholars across the disciplines to think about. There's plenty for scientists to work on. There's plenty for philosophers to work on, for literary people to work on. I'm in awe of this being, but I mean, wouldn't want to be standing there being burned up inside that, right? It's very scary. But I think getting away from this binary of good versus evil, this is neither of those, right? This is so much more complicated than that. And if we live inside that worldview, it serves to disentangle all of these complex relations between beings, right? And so I get really excited about some of the work that certain forms of ecology are doing, right? Where they're beginning to articulate these as sets of relations, and maybe sets of relations out of whack because we've taken too much or changed things too much, right? We're not living in a good we're not living in a good way with all of these other beings in the world, and this fire is much larger than we've seen, right, because of that. And it's not that they're in a smaller incarnation, it's good and normal and necessary, right? You might not like being out of control either. So anyway, this is all food for thought. I mean, I think, it opens up a lot for us. Kristen, you know?
Well, I have two, but that kind of depends on. So I was going to ask about the question of the medium, right? And so thinking about a lot of the citational field which you're pulling from of the new materialisms and interrogating the animacy, there is this kind of what is the affective work of crisis doing, and how kind of Indigenous metaphysics are falling in or being marshaled to do a certain type of work. And then the second question was about the Pipestone and the move to resources. So I was which also kind of links it in this larger kind of advocacy framework, right? If we think of resource extraction and what Kim Fortune calls of living in the era of late industrialism. So you mentioned how the sacred could also be a form of survival. So I was really interested in the legislative work of kind of making it a national monument and kind of the work that sacred is doing to protect, right?
Yep.
But then it's also doing a type of violence, which I think you're beautifully gesturing towards the common.
Yeah. There's a lot in what you just said. It is. A lot of the stories that come out about Pipestone are that there's this notion now that's pretty widespread in our area that you have to put the pipe away between ceremonies and you have to keep it hidden and it's so sacred it has to be private. And I've heard some people say that we did that because the Christians were coming around and were threatening to take things. That's why these things got so private and had to be hidden, right? And so we developed this elevated language around that I think is getting away from this more relational language into this more elevated language. And then also you're influenced by Christianity. I mean, the way that if you go back and read Eastman and the Dakota text by Ella Deloria and some of that stuff that was written around the turn of the 20th century, it is heartbreaking. The violence that was done to our ancestors. I mean, you don't fully realize till you go in and read this stuff. They couldn't be open about anything, and we have lost so much because they couldn't speak those stories, they couldn't write those things down. And so there's no blame about us taking up this language that was strategic and helped us to maintain whatever we could. But I think we are at a moment where we can perhaps move a little bit away from that and have a little bit of breathing room, especially with all the language revitalization going on, to move back into our languages now and to search for a better language for us. The other question you had about the marshaling of Indigenous perspectives towards Anthropocene kind of crisis language, I mean, I haven't really thought about that as much. I'm really happy to see that we've got Indigenous scholars taking this up, right? This ecological angst and depression that people are having, it was really interesting for me to realize, wait a minute, why am I not freaked out? It's not like I'm a denier. Oh, because we've already been in apocalypse since 1862, right? We're what Evan Kirksey calls sites of biocultural hope. Indians are. Amidst the ruin, there were some of us that lived and are now thriving. And we're actually in my ancestor, Little Crow. I mean, people were talking in 1862, 7 generations is what it's going to take to do any recovery at all. Well, my child is 7th generation from that, and so, and this is. Again, this is what I see, as I said, Kim Anderson, a lot of Indigenous people doing this. It's, I never have a climate change denier in the room when I teach an Indigenous studies class, but at the same time, we're also working on these thriving in these sites of hope. So anyway, I don't know, you probably have more to say on the question you asked but I'm really happy to see young Indigenous scholars taking this stuff up. Because I do think we're at a moment when we can have more conversations than we were previously able to have, and I would like to see you be very assertive and get in scientists' faces as well. You know, they don't have the right to narrate the world. They are no different than priests and missionaries were. They think they have the right to narrate the world, and they have the God-given or Darwin-given truth. They're the same, and they don't, right? So, be strong. I don't know where they're, yes.
So I'm interested in your engagement with Jane Bennett and Mel Chen. And I don't know if I have a fully formed thought here, so I'm going to try to form one.
Neither do I.
I'm really sorry if it just sounds like a jumble of words. But I've been engaging with Jane Bennett a lot recently, and then kind of other scholars kind of centered around the work that she's doing. And I'm interested in the work they're doing in kind of theorizing what some have called a flat ontology, right? So I'm interested in the way that you kind of...
Can you define that?
No.
Okay.
Right, well, I mean, because so like Jane Bennett's vibrant matter.
Right.
Right?
Are you thinking it's less hierarchical?
Yeah, so it's like, it's doing away with all hierarchy, so that in her book, when she sees like the trash in the street of the city, right, like she sees the dead rat, and that all of those things are also still vibrant. They're vibrant matter, and they are actants on the world in kind of the same way that humans are, or I mean in a different way, but in no less important of a way. Right, so it's undoing kind of, I don't even know if I'm explaining this very well.
You are, that's great.
But it's undoing kind of like thinking about what defines something as an actant. And I'm interested in thinking about like, maybe how does that idea play into kind of what you're talking about here? Is this, right, like, are the kinships that you're kind of interested in theorizing and thinking about, is this a step toward a flatter ontology? Is that at all not like a good way to even think about it? What was that? I'm sorry.
You mean is the new materialism stuff a step towards that, or is the indigenous stuff I'm talking about?
The indigenous stuff you're talking about, right? Like, is that even not a good way to think about it?
You know, I think the articulation of that as a flat ontology is good. I think, again, I think we could sit at a conversational table and have a better conversation with that word versus our senses of relations, being in relation, than you could have had previously, right, with the more hierarchical thinkers. What's really interesting to me is to watch new materialisms and these other secular academic thinkers struggle mightily for language because they want to be secular. They have to be, right? And that's cool. Do that if that's your worldview. I get that. It's not our worldview. And they're struggling for, and it's hard when you can't invoke spirit, right? It's hard to figure out how do we talk about life and vibrancy, and that's why their language is so complicated. But I'm all for them trying to figure that out. When I go through that literature, though, I mean, I make my own index, and in Vibrant Matter, I think I have 117 places where she could have talked about indigenous thought, and never once does she. Like, and it's, you know, that's this literature is like that. You know, they use the royal we did this. Not everybody is part of that we, right? Some of us get it, but we're using a different language is all. So.
I'm interested in that, right? Like the problem with some of like Jane Bennett and all of this stuff is that like flattening an ontology or flattening ontologies kind of stops paying attention to the fact that, right, like indigenous communities have been dealing with apocalyptic issues for hundreds of years, right? And so, in what way does like that kind of cause even more of a problem? I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, I mean, all the young indigenous scholars working in this area, and they're pretty much young except for a couple of us, have pointed this out, right? Where we have an Indigenous Materialisms panel executive session at the American Anthropology Association this fall, so that'll be pretty exciting, and a couple of people in this room are on that. So people are speaking back already, right? I mean, for me as a Native Studies scholar, I'm not interested in, I don't want to go reform philosophy or anthropology anymore. I'm happy to go hang out with them and be at their table if it serves my interests. But I'm kind of interested in pulling those students and scholars who are in the other disciplines, and gradually I'm hoping bringing them back towards Indigenous studies And we can hang out together and maybe even engage in a little intimate relations, but in the end, I want us to build our own thing. Yeah, but we can't not talk to them, obviously. Yes?
Can I just follow up on this discussion? I mean, one of the critiques of the new materialism literature is that it's a post-human literature and it evacuates politics, essentially. So I'm just very keen to hear from you on that particular question, because you've given us a wonderful talk that's, if you like, full of the agency of things, but perpetually brings us back to the human relationships. And so I just wonder if you see a tension at work there with the way you're modelling the world of people and affected things.
I mean, I don't see that literature as post-politics. What is the particular critique? That it's losing sight of like race, class, and gender or something? Or by the turn to the interspecies move.
But that's one element of what happens.
Yeah, I think you're going to be hard-pressed to find Indigenous scholars, once we grapple with what the hell new materialism means, saying that it's losing sight of social justice projects, because we have not forgotten we live in close, intimate relation with non-humans. So we're not going to say, what about the actually, my mom said this recently, but that's about if I talk to her, what about the poor starving children, or what about people of color, blah, blah, blah. I think we pretty much know our fates are entangled with the fates of our non-human relatives. So I understand on one level those critiques. On another level, that's not coming from an Indigenous standpoint, I think. And that's why we need to be in part of these conversations. Was there another hand before I go to you?
This is such an interesting conversation for me about knowledge politics and sort of the ways that Indigenous studies might be in conversation with, but not necessarily wanting to sort of like open itself super duper up or feed other fields at the expense of itself, given various histories of like knowledge colonization. And I guess I'm interested in your question in terms of that kind of either or, like, is it going to be this thing, or is it going to be new materialism, or is it going to be science, as you were saying over there? And that comes out of, in some ways, a marketplace of knowledge where fields are competing with each other for dominance as an explanatory framework. And I feel like part of what you're talking about is what happens when we think in a more systems-based way, which would include, as you were saying earlier, which was so exciting, like, okay, there's tons of room for humanists and scientists and literary people and, like, who knows what all to think and talk about older and newer materialisms all together. Like, in a moment of crisis that's been ongoing for some people and is like suddenly news to others who've had blinders on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I get that there are some pragmatic concerns, right? But I'm looking at the opportunities right now. But it's also convenient for me to look at the opportunities. I sit at the nexus of science, technology, Indigenous studies, and the humanities. Right, it's a good place for me to be. I think are we out of time? Okay, all right, thanks. Thank you.
Take one more